The phone rang just as Annie put down her paintbrush. It was Nathan, his voice as cold and distant as the silent nights they had spent together, cut through the room. "I'll be late. Don't wait up." Short, curt, emotionless. Annie froze, her hand gripping the paintbrush tightly as her gaze fell on the half-finished painting before her. The canvas depicted a vibrant room alive with laughter and warmth, a stark contradiction to the cold, pristine silence of her own home. The bright hues felt like a cruel joke in this too big, too perfect house, where she often felt like a forgotten background character waiting for someone else to turn the page. The doorbell rang, pulling Annie from her thoughts. Her heart skipped a beat. Who could it be at this hour? She hesitated before walking down the hallway, her fingers trembling as they reached the doorknob. She opened the door, and for a fleeting moment of foolish hope, she thought it might be Nathan, bearing flowers, maybe an apology. But it wasn't Nathan. It was Elias, Nathan's half-brother. Rain clung to his leather jacket, a tool bag resting casually on his shoulder. He gave her a half-smile, effortless, yet somehow disarming. "Annie," he greeted her, his voice warm. "I hope I'm not bothering you." "Elias? What are you doing here so late?" she'd asked, her tone steady, though her pulse had already quickened. "Nathan sent me," he replied, stepping closer with an ease that felt strangely natural. "Said there were a few things around the house that needed fixing. He figured you wouldn't need the help, but—" His smile softened, a teasing glint in his eyes. I think he underestimated just how wrong he could be. A soft laugh, unexpected and unguarded, escaped Annie's lips. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. The door clicked shut, and something shifted. The house suddenly felt alive, the air thick with an energy Annie hadn't felt in months. Elias set down his tool bag, his eyes scanning the room with quiet curiosity. "This place," he said, almost to himself. "It's just like Nathan, polished, perfect, and suffocating." Annie laughed again, short and sharp, the sound surprising even her. "He does like everything neat and orderly." "And you?" Elias asked, his gaze locking onto hers under the soft hallway light. "Do you like living in all this order?" The question hung in the air, catching Annie off guard. She hesitated, turning toward the kitchen to escape the intensity of his stare. Pretending to rummage through the fridge, she tried to steady herself. But his words lingered, casting shadows that wrapped around her thoughts. A simple question, yet it stirred something deeper, something she wasn't sure she was ready to face. Annie fumbled with the water bottle, her hands trembling as she caught the sound of footsteps approaching. He moved closer, too close, and she felt the heat of his presence against the chill of the house. "Annie," he said, her name a quiet, intimate murmur that made her breath hitch. Slowly, she turned to face him, and for the first time, she saw it. Something raw and unfiltered in his gaze. It wasn't playful or teasing. It was intensity in its purest form. Her thoughts slipped from Nathan, his hollow gestures, the muted routines that had wrung any joy from her life. Elias was here now, standing inches away, his presence consuming the kitchen like a flame newly ignited. The storm Elias had brought into her life wasn't just unsettling her home, it was unraveling her heart. The golden light of the kitchen seemed to dim as his earlier words echoed relentlessly in her mind. "Do you like this life?" She hadn't answered, not because she didn't want to, but because she didn't know. Her life with Nathan felt too much like a meticulously framed painting. Polished, perfect, lifeless. Once, Nathan was alive with passion, someone who marveled at her art and her unfinished canvases. He'd kiss her paint-smeared hands and whisper how they held the power to create entire worlds. But time had worn him into someone colder, quieter, consumed by work calls and ignored promises. She became a fixture in her own home, just another part of his curated world. Annie tried to hold on. Just weeks ago, she had set the table, candles flickering, a romantic dinner, and her favorite dress waiting for his notice. But when Nathan walked through the door, he loosened his tie, mumbled he was too tired, and opened his laptop. Alone, she'd sat at the table that evening, silent tears falling onto plates of untouched food. Elias was different. Where Nathan saw right through her, Elias saw every part of her, the flaws, the fractures, the pieces she refused to acknowledge even to herself. His words were sparse but cutting, peeling back her defenses with an almost unbearable clarity. One afternoon, tie-dyeing the studio together, he'd asked quietly, "Did you love painting as much as you used to?" Elias had a way of reaching places within her that she didn't want explored, yet found herself craving. And in his gaze, she started to see herself again, the woman who once ran her fingers across vivid palettes, who saw the world as colors to be discovered, now buried but not entirely lost. Annie stood before one of her unfinished paintings, her eyes tracing the bold yet incomplete strokes. Her chest tightened as she absorbed the emotions embedded in the work. She didn't respond immediately, her hands trembling as memories of losing herself in her art flooded her mind. "I used to think painting was everything," she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, uneven with emotion. "But now, I'm not sure I can feel anything at all." Elias carefully set the painting aside and stepped closer, his eyes locking on hers, uncomfortably perceptive. "Then why did you stop?" he asked softly. Her eyes clouded with sadness as she hesitated, then finally whispered, "Because Nathan doesn't need it. He needs a perfect wife, not an artist with paint-smeared hands." Elias chuckled quietly, though there was a bitterness undercutting the sound. "So you gave up who you are to become what he wanted. Is it worth it, Annie?" She didn't reply, but the question lingered, striking a nerve that she couldn't ignore. It wasn't a question for him, but one she would need to answer for herself. That night, raindrops painted streaks across the glass, tapping gently like the echo of unspoken emotions. Annie stood by the window, arms wrapped tightly around herself, her gaze lost in the muted veil of falling rain. Nathan had been gone for 2 days, and with each passing hour, the house grew colder, emptier. But tonight felt different. Elias was here. From the kitchen came the quiet clinking of objects as Elias busied himself with something. The faint sounds broke through the stifling silence Annie had learned to live with. Moments later, he appeared in the living room doorway, holding 2 mugs of steaming cocoa. "You need this," he said with a mischievous twinkle in his eye, as though he could sense how badly she needed some warmth, both inside and out. Annie allowed herself a small smile, accepting the warm mug. "You always know how to lighten the mood," she said quietly, her voice softer than usual. Elias sat beside her, close enough that the warmth of his presence seemed to fill the empty space between them. "Are you always this tense?" he asked, his tone equal parts teasing and genuinely curious. A laugh escaped her lips before she could stop it. "I don't think I'm tense. Maybe I've just forgotten how to relax." "Relaxing isn't hard," he replied, tilting his head as he studied her. "You just have to want to try." Annie opened her mouth to protest, but a brilliant flash of lightning illuminated the room, immediately followed by a thunderclap that rattled the windows, leaving her momentarily speechless. The rain lashed against the windows, each drop hammering harder, as if testing the limits of the glass. Elias raised an eyebrow and stood, a glint of mischief in his eyes. "Ever gone walking in the rain?" he asked, his tone brimming with challenge. "You're kidding, right? Look at it out there. It's pouring." Annie shook her head, but before she could say anything more, Elias grabbed her hand and pulled her to her feet. "There are some things in life you just have to do," he said, his grin unwavering. "Come on." Before she could protest, he led her out the front door. The icy downpour hit them instantly, soaking through their clothes. Annie's surprise turned to laughter, real unrestrained laughter that melted into the rhythm of the storm. It wasn't just the rain drenching her, it felt as though the storm was washing away layers of invisible weights she hadn't realized she was carrying. They stumbled into the backyard, the stone steps gleaming under the dim glow of the porch light. Standing there, drenched and breathless, Annie didn't care about the chill. For the first time in ages, she felt alive. No filters, no performance. Just her, the rain, and a startling sense of freedom. Elias stepped closer, his gaze locking onto hers with an intensity that made her chest tighten. "Do you know what you look like when you laugh?" His voice was low, reverent. Annie stilled, the sound of her laughter fading. "What?" she whispered, her voice trembling as though she just stumbled upon a part of herself long forgotten. Elias closed the space between them, close enough for her to feel his breath mingle with the cold rain. "Have you ever thought," he asked softly, "if you lived differently, if you allowed yourself to, would you be happier?" The question hung in the air, weaving through the storm and settling deep within her. Annie wanted to respond, to say something, but the words wouldn't come. Elias slowly raised his hand, hesitating before brushing his fingertips against her cheek. His touch was so light, so tentative, as though waiting for her to pull away. She didn't. Their eyes met, and in that suspended moment, every ounce of logic and control Annie had clung to slipped away. Elias leaned in, his lips brushing softly against hers. A fleeting touch, barely a kiss, but it was enough to send waves of warmth rippling through her, chasing away the chill. Annie closed her eyes, leaning into the tender moment, letting her fears and defenses dissolve into the rain. When they finally pulled apart, Annie's breath came in uneven bursts, her heart pounding in her chest. Elias stared at her, his expression caught between longing and uncertainty. His voice was raw when he said, "If you want me to stop, I will." But Annie didn't answer. She stood still as the rain soaked through to her very skin, every suppressed feeling bubbling to the surface, unyielding, undeniable. Soft rays of morning light slipped through the curtains, brushing gently against Annie's face. Yet the storm raging in her mind remained untouched by the warmth of daylight. Sitting upright in bed, she gripped the blanket as if it was the only thing grounding her amid the emptiness threatening to swallow her whole. The memory of last night lingered, a searing imprint not just on her lips but deep within her. The kiss with Elias wasn't fleeting, it was a spark, an undeniable awakening of feelings she had buried for years. But now, in the stark clarity of day, the weight of it pressed down on her with crushing intensity. Last night wasn't an impulsive error, it was a boundary crossed, a line obliterated. Elias had left that morning, but not without a note. The words, though few, carried profound weight. "Last night was real. I'll wait for you." Annie stared at the note, its presence a heavy reminder of the decision looming over her, a decision that had come far quicker than she was prepared for. The hours passed in a haze as her thoughts wrestled for clarity. By noon, she was still caught in the web of her own mind when the sound of the front door opening jolted her upright. Nathan was home. He entered with his usual wariness, though today there was something sharper about his gaze. His eyes lingered on her a moment too long. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low, but laced with suspicion. "I'm fine," Annie replied quickly, avoiding his eyes, as if prolonged contact might unravel her composure. That unease followed them to dinner that evening. Annie, Nathan, and Elias sat at the table, the air between them thick with unspoken truths. Elias kept a strained facade of casualness, but his fleeting glances at Annie betrayed him. Nathan, though silent, seemed to note every subtle shift in the air. Finally, the tension snapped. Nathan set his knife down abruptly, his voice clear yet cutting. "Elias, you've been staying here for quite some time now, haven't you? Seems like you're getting a bit too comfortable in my house." His gaze burned with accusation. Elias smirked faintly, his jaw tightening as though preparing a retort. But before he could, Annie intervened. "Nathan, don't start," she said, her tone firm yet fraught with tension. "I asked Elias to stay. He's been helping with things around the house. He hasn't been a bother." Nathan's sharp eyes turned to her, piercing and searching. "Is that so, Annie? Or is there something you're not telling me?" His voice landed like a hammer, breaking the brittle silence into shots. Annie's chest tightened. Her breath caught as the weight of his words settled heavily between them. For a moment, she felt as though the walls were closing in, suffocating her. She fought to maintain her composure. "What are you talking about, Nathan?" she'd asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. Nathan didn't respond immediately, his gaze unwavering and unreadable. After what felt like an eternity, he rose from the table and left the room without another word, leaving the air thick with the echo of his presence. The silence that followed was deafening. Elias broke it quietly but firmly. "Are you going to tell him?" he asked, his voice steady yet tinged with urgency. Annie turned to him, her eyes glistening with tears. "And what should I say, Elias? That I betrayed him? That I felt something I shouldn't have?" Elias leaned forward, his gaze locking with hers. "It's not about what you shouldn't feel. It's about what you deserve to feel. It's about being brave enough to choose the life you want." His words struck like a tidal wave, raw and unrelenting. But Annie didn't respond. She stood abruptly, leaving the table and disappearing into the shadowed hallway. Elias watched her retreat, his eyes following her until she vanished from sight. That night, as Annie lay in bed, silent tears streamed down her face, soaking into her pillow. She stood at a crossroads, one path leading to a marriage built on responsibility, but devoid of warmth, the other to a wild, unpredictable connection with Elias. Both demanded sacrifices she wasn't certain she had the strength to make. Sleep eluded her. The night stretched on endlessly, her mind caught in an inescapable labyrinth of tangled emotions and impossible choices. The wind whistled through the cracks in the windows, a chilling reminder that time was slipping away, indifferent to her inner chaos. Annie lay in the suffocating silence, her heart pounding wildly, each beat echoing like a plea to escape. Unable to endure the weight of the bedroom any longer, she swung her legs over the edge of the bed and stepped into the hallway. The darkness wasn't comforting, it was eerie. Her bare feet creaked against the cold wooden floor, each step pulling her closer to a decision she wasn't ready to make. Reaching the living room, she noticed the door ajar and a faint glow spilling out into the hall. Inside, Elias sat hunched forward, eyes lost in thought. He didn't look up as she entered, but her presence shifted the room's stillness. She hesitated near the doorway. Finally, Elias spoke, breaking the silence. "Have you decided yet?" His voice was steady, but it carried a tremor. Annie stepped closer, her gaze fixed on the flickering lamplight. The uncertainty of its glow mirrored the turmoil in her mind. "I don't know, Elias," she whispered. "It's all so overwhelming. I don't know if I have the courage to change." Standing, Elias cautiously approached her. His hand brushed hers, the lightest of touches. "I'm here," he said, his tone firm yet sincere. "No matter what you choose. But Annie, you need to start living for yourself, not anyone else." His words pierced through her defenses, striking a chord she wasn't ready to face. Who had she been? A passionate artist? A free spirit? Or merely a background figure in Nathan's world? Before she could answer, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. Nathan appeared in the doorway, his face unreadable, his eyes sharp with suspicion, as they darted to the space between Annie and Elias. The tension in the room solidified under his hard gaze. "Annie," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "What's going on here?" Time seemed to freeze. Annie's heart felt like it had stopped altogether. Elias stood firm, his eyes locked on Nathan's. Annie took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Nathan," she began, her voice trembling but resolute, "we need to talk." Nathan's expression hardened as he raised a hand to silence her. "There's nothing to talk about," he said, cold and clipped. "I've seen enough." His words weighed down the room, final and immovable. Without waiting for a reply, he turned and walked away, his footsteps receding into the shadows. Annie didn't follow. She didn't call out to stop him. She stood frozen, her vision blurring as tears filled her eyes. Elias stepped closer, but this time, Annie held up her hand. "No, Elias," she said, voice breaking. "I need to be alone." Elias nodded, anguish painted across his face. "All right," he murmured. "You know where to find me if you need me." He turned and left, leaving Annie to the silence of the house, now emptier than before. Sinking into a chair, Annie buried her face in her hands. She knew there was no returning to what was. Whatever choice she'd make, The threshold had been crossed. Nothing would be the same again. By morning, the house was silent. Nathan was gone. Elias was gone. It was just her, the pale sunlight streaming through the windows, and the weight of her own solitude. She sat at her work table, picking up a paintbrush for the first time in years. This time, she wasn't painting to please anyone. She wasn't painting to escape. She was painting for herself. On the canvas, a bird broke free from an open cage, its wings outstretched toward an uncertain but limitless sky. The painting was unfinished. Annie didn't feel rushed. For the first time, she realized that life didn't need tidy endings to hold meaning. Some stories, like hers, could simply continue.